Come closer, child. Sit by the fire. Feel the warmth on your face. My name is Senua. I am old now, older than the pyramids. It sometimes feels. My hands are gnarled and my eyes are dim. But I remember. I remember everything. I was a healer in the workers' camp beneath the Great Pyramid. I held the hands of the dying. I whispered prayers for the forgotten. I saw things that would make the stars weep. And I saw things that made me believe in the goodness of humanity. Before I begin, I wonder, where are you listening from tonight? Are you in a quiet room, a cozy home, a place where the stars shine brightly? I love knowing where my stories travel. It reminds me that we are all connected by the same stars, the same stories, the same warmth. Tonight, I will tell you about a man I knew. A man who built a mountain with his bare hands. A man who escaped the shadow of the Pharaoh. His name was Kemet. But this story is not just about him. It is also about a girl who learned to be brave. That girl was me. Close your eyes, child. Let the fire dance behind your eyelids. Let my voice be the only sound in your world. Let me carry you back to the banks of the Nile thousands of years ago, to a time when the world was young and the gods walked among us. Let me tell you about Kemet, child. And let me tell you about the world he was born into. His name meant Black Earth, the rich, dark soil of the Nile that gives life to our people. It was a good name, a strong name. It was a name that carried the weight of generations. He was born in a humble village, a small cluster of mud brick huts along the banks of the great river. There were perhaps 50 families, all bound together by blood and by the river that sustained them. They were not rich. They had no gold, no jewels, no palaces, but they had each other and they had the land. Kemet's father was a farmer. I can still picture him in my mind, a tall man with strong, weathered hands and a back bent from years of working the soil. He rose before the sun each day, and he returned home only when the sun had fallen behind the horizon. His skin was leathery from the sun, and his hands were calloused from the plow. But when he looked at his son, his eyes softened. He loved Kemet with a fierce, quiet love. Kemet's mother was a weaver. She sat at her loom from dawn until dusk, her fingers moving in a rhythm that never seemed to tire. She wove linen as white as the moon and as fine as anything sold in the markets of Memphis. I can still hear her humming old songs about the gods, about the Nile, about the green fields of their ancestors. She hummed while she worked, and her voice was like water flowing over smooth stones. Kemet was their only child, a son they had waited many years for, a child born after many prayers to the gods. Their home was small, just 2 rooms with walls of mud brick and a roof of dried reeds. The floor was packed earth, swept clean each morning. In one corner stood the loom, and in the other, a small hearth where they cooked their meals. The walls were bare, but they were home. They were love. They were everything. Kemet was a boy who laughed easily. He chased goats through the fields, his feet bare against the warm earth. He splashed in the shallow waters of the Nile, feeling the cool water wrap around his legs. He helped his father plant barley, his small hands pushing seeds into the soil. He helped his mother weave, his clumsy fingers learning the rhythm of the loom. Kemet once told me he dreamed of owning the small field beside his father's land. He wanted a house of his own someday, with children running through the barley, and a wife who hummed while she worked, just like his mother. He never told anyone that, not even his father. It was his secret dream, the one he carried in his heart like a seed waiting to grow. Can you imagine it, child? The warmth of the sun on your face, the smell of fresh bread baking over the fire, the sound of your mother's voice as she hummed old songs. That was Kemet's world. It was simple. It was humble. It was beautiful. He did not know that the gods were watching him. He did not know that his life was about to change forever. But the gods always have their plans, and the gods are not always kind. Before I tell you what happened to Kemet, let me tell you about myself. Let me tell you about my own village, my own family, my own childhood. Because my story and his story are woven together, 2 threads in the same tapestry. My village was small, perhaps 50 families, like Kemet's, nestled along a bend in the Nile where the water ran slow, and the soil was dark and rich. We were not rich. We had no gold, no jewels, but we had the river, and we had each other. My father was a fisherman. He rose before the sun each day, taking his small boat out onto the river, casting his nets into the mist. His hands were rough from years of pulling ropes, and his skin was weathered from the sun. But when he returned home, he always had a smile for me. He would scoop me up in his arms and spin me around, and I would laugh and laugh until I could not breathe. My mother was a weaver, like Kemet's mother. She sat at her loom from dawn until dusk, her fingers moving in a rhythm that never seemed to tire. She wove linen as fine as anything sold in the markets of Thebes. She hummed while she worked, old songs about the gods and the river and the green fields of our ancestors. I would sit beside her, watching her hands dance across the threads, and she would tell me stories of her own childhood. Our home was small, just 2 rooms with walls of mud brick and a roof of dried reeds. The floor was packed earth, swept clean each morning. In the corner stood my mother's loom, and against the wall, my father's fishing nets hung drying. The smell of fish hung in the air, mixed with the smell of the river and the dust of the desert. We had little, but we had warmth. We had laughter. We had each other. My mother taught me to weave, but my father taught me something more important. He taught me to read the river, to see where the fish swam, to know the season by the color of the water, to sense the change in the air before a storm came. He taught me patience. He taught me that the Nile was a gift, a god that gave us life. I was 10 years old when the soldiers came to our village. 10 years old when everything changed. 10 years old when I learned what fear truly meant. I remember that day as if it were yesterday. The sun was high overhead and the air was still. I was sitting beside my mother, watching her weave. Her fingers moved in a rhythm I had seen 1,000 times before, back and forth, the shuttle passing between the threads. My father had gone to the river with his nets. I could see him in my mind, standing in his small boat, casting his nets into the water. I could see the ripples spreading across the surface, the way the sun sparkled on the water. Then came the shouts. I remember the sound of it, the sudden, sharp crack of voices raised in fear. I remember the heavy rumble of sandals on packed earth. I remember the clatter of spears and the jingle of armor. I ran to the door and saw them, soldiers, dozens of them, marching through our village like a plague. They were not like the soldiers I had seen before. These men had no mercy in their eyes. They looked at us like we were cattle, like we were nothing. Fear took over. My stomach twisted. My mouth went dry. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold on to the doorframe. I had never felt anything like it before. I did what I had never done before. I hid. I crawled deep into a basket behind my mother's loom, curling into a ball, covering my ears, trying to disappear. Through the cracks, I heard my mother scream. I heard the sound of our door being kicked open. I heard the crash of my mother's loom as it fell to the ground, the threads snapping, the wood splintering. I heard her call my father's name, Kemet, Kemet. And then I heard the heavy sound of a blow, a dull, sickening thud. She fell to the earth, and I did not come out. I did not help. I was simply too afraid. They took my brother away that day. He was 16 tall, strong, proud. I heard him scream. I heard him call out my name. Senua, Senua, help me. I did not answer. I could not. beat him to the ground, and they dragged him away in chains. My mother cried out, and I heard her scream his name. I heard the sound of her weeping, and I did nothing. They did not take me. I was too small, too young, completely invisible. But I saw everything. I saw my mother's broken loom. I saw my father's empty nets. I saw the blood on the floor. My father returned at dusk. He found our home broken, his wife weeping, his son gone. After that day, he rarely smiled. He never spoke of my brother again. I think it was too painful for him to even say his name. I have carried that shame my whole life, child. I have carried it like a stone in my chest. I never told anyone. I never spoke of it. I buried it deep inside me, in a place I would not touch. 6 years passed after that terrible day. My brother never returned. My mother rarely sang again. I grew older and learned to weave, and eventually apprenticed under the village healer, an old woman who taught me to set bones and clean wounds. But the fear never left me. It followed me everywhere, like a shadow I could not outrun. I often wondered if my brother thought I had abandoned him. If, in his last moments, he believed I had chosen not to save him. That thought haunted me more than the soldiers ever could. Kemet told me about the day the soldiers came to his village. He was 14 years old, just a boy, barely a man. The sun was rising over the fields, and the air was cool. The birds were singing, and the river was glinting in the distance. He was working alongside his father, planting barley. His hands were in the soil, soft and warm beneath his fingers. Then came the shouts, the creaking of carts, the rumble of officials approaching across the fields. He looked up and saw them, soldiers, dozens of them, marching across the green fields like a storm. Dust rose around them, and the earth trembled beneath their weight. He felt the ground shaking beneath his feet, and he knew something terrible was coming. But these were not slave traders. They were the Pharaoh's conscription force, sent by the king himself to gather men for the Great Pyramid. Word had spread through the villages that the Pharaoh Khufu was building his tomb, a mountain of stone that would touch the sky. To build it, he needed thousands of men, and the Pharaoh's will was law. The officials traveled from village to village, selecting the strongest young men. They did not ask. They did not negotiate. They simply took what they needed. Kemet was not a slave. He was a farmer's son. But that did not matter. The Pharaoh needed men, and every family had to give. If they refused, the soldiers would burn their homes and take them anyway. They took the young men, bound their wrists with leather straps, and told them, "You work for Egypt now." Kemet tried to run, but a soldier grabbed him by the hair and pulled him to the ground. He felt the sharp sting of the soldier's grip, the cruel twist of his hand. He struggled, but the soldier was too strong. He bound Kemet's wrists with leather straps, pulling them tight until the leather bit into his skin. His mother screamed. I have heard many screams in my life. Child, the screams of women giving birth, the screams of men dying, the screams of the wounded and the broken. But a mother's scream when her child is taken, that is the worst sound in the world. It is a sound that never leaves you. She ran toward him, but the soldier pushed her away. She fell to the ground, her face striking the dirt. His father tried to fight, but the soldier struck him with the butt of a spear. He collapsed to the ground, bleeding. Kemet looked back as they dragged him away. He saw his mother on her knees, her arms reaching out to him. He saw his father's blood on the dirt. He saw his home growing smaller and smaller in the distance. And that was the last time he saw them. He told me this years later, child. He wept as he spoke, and I held his hands in silence. I did not tell him about my brother. I did not tell him about my own shame. I just held his hands, and I said nothing. There are no words for such pain. I was 16 when the summons came for healers to travel to the workers' camp beneath the Pharaoh's great pyramid. Word spread that the construction was taking a terrible toll, men dying from exhaustion, infection, and the cruelty of the overseers. I volunteered. Perhaps I believed that if I could save others, I might finally find a way to forgive myself. Perhaps I wanted to prove that I was no longer the girl who hid in the shadows. Perhaps I simply wanted to face the darkness that had haunted me since my brother was taken. Whatever the reason, I went. I gathered my bandages, my herbs, my few belongings. I kissed my mother's forehead and held my father's hands one last time. And I walked toward the mountain of stone that would change my life forever. But when I met Kemet, I understood something I had never understood before. We both had our chains. His were made of iron. Mine were made of fear. And I decided, child, I decided I would break mine. I would not be the girl who hid in the shadows. I would not be the girl who watched the world crumble and did nothing. I would be brave. I would be strong. I would be the healer I was meant to be. I have thought about that moment many times since then. And I have learned this. The chains that bind your hands are nothing compared to the chains that bind your heart. The iron on your wrists can be cut, but the fear in your chest, that is harder to break. But it is not impossible. Kemet broke his chains, and so did I. And that child, that is where our story truly begins. Kemet told me about the march. He spoke of it only once, many years later, when the memories had softened with time. Even then, his voice grew heavy. His hands trembled. He said, "Senua, I have seen death in many forms, but nothing prepared me for the march." I held his hands and said nothing. Sometimes silence is the only gift we can give. The march began at dawn. The soldiers shouted at the men to move, striking them with sticks if they were too slow. Kemet had been given no water, no food. His hands were still bound with leather straps, and the leather had already begun to bite into his skin. He walked. He walked because if he stopped, he would die. He walked because somewhere deep in his heart, he still believed he would see his mother again. The sun rose higher, and the heat became unbearable. Kemet could feel the sun burning his shoulders. He could taste the grit of the sand in his mouth. His lips were already cracking, and his tongue was swollen from thirst. Men collapsed one by one. Kemet described a man falling beside him, his face already red and swollen from the sun. He made no sound. He just folded into the sand, his mouth open, his eyes already empty. Kemet stepped over him without looking down. He had learned not to look. Looking meant remembering, and remembering meant he would stop walking. I have walked through the desert myself, child. I know the weight of the sun. I know the cruelty of the mirage, but I never had to walk it in chains. Kemet did, and he survived. Kemet walked past a man who had been a fisherman. He remembered him from the village. He had been kind. He had shared his bread with Kemet the night before. Now, he was just a body in the sand. Kemet wanted to stop. He wanted to kneel beside him and say a prayer. But he knew that if he stopped, he would not get up again. So he kept walking. He walked because he had not yet said goodbye. He walked because somewhere deep in his heart, the fire still burned. Beside him walked an old man named Senua. I remember his hands twisted and gnarled, the fingers bent at odd angles, the skin cracked like dried mud. He had held more stones than he had ever held a child. And yet, when he spoke of freedom, his eyes still glowed with a fire that had refused to die. "Keep walking, boy," Senua said. "The dead are behind you." "The horizon is all that matters," Kemet asked. "How do you survive?" Senua smiled a tired, weathered smile. "I survive because I remember who I am. I am not a slave. I am a man who was taken. And one day, I will be free again." That gave Kemet something he had not felt since the soldiers came. Hope. Kemet learned quickly to fear the overseers. They were Egyptian soldiers, hardened by years of cruelty. They carried whips made of leather, and they used them without hesitation. Kemet saw a man fall. He was young, perhaps 17. He had tried to escape. The The soldiers caught him and dragged him back. They beat him until he could not move, then they left him in the sand. The vultures circled overhead, waiting. Kemet looked away. He could not bear to watch, but he heard the screams. He heard the crack of the whip. He heard the silence that followed. He learned to keep his head down and his mouth shut. He learned to disappear into the crowd of men. He learned to survive. But even in the midst of suffering, there were moments of humanity. I remember Kemet telling me about an old man who shared his water with a stranger, a man he had never met before. He said, "We are all walking the same road. We may as well walk it together." And sometimes, at night, a few of the men would sing old songs of the Nile, songs of home, songs of the green fields they left behind. They sang softly, so the soldiers would not hear, but they sang. And for a little while, they were not conscripts. They were men. Kemet walked for days. The pain in his feet became a constant companion. I have known pain like that, child, not from a march, but from carrying guilt. I wonder if he felt the same weight I did. I wonder if he, too, was haunted by the faces of those he left behind. His mind drifted between the fire in his throat and the faces of those he had lost. He could not hold a thought for long. The heat scattered his mind like dust. But through the haze, he thought of his mother. He remembered the sound of her humming as she worked her voice like water over smooth stones. He had never told her how much he loved that sound. He had never said goodbye. He would never get the chance. Above all, Kemet feared forgetting. He feared that one day he would wake and no longer remember the sound of his mother's voice, the shape of his father's hands, the smell of the fields at dawn. That fear, more than the overseer's whips, kept him walking. On the third day, Kemet saw water in the distance. His heart leaped. He ran toward it, his leather bindings dragging behind him. But the water was not real. It was a mirage, a cruel trick of the desert. He fell to his knees, and for the first time he wept. He wept for his mother. He wept for his father. He wept for the life that had been stolen from him. Senua knelt beside him. He did not speak. He just placed a hand on Kemet's shoulder. "I have seen the water 100 times, boy. It never helps to chase it." Kemet wiped his tears. He stood up. He kept walking. Kemet watched the birds that circled above. He had seen them as a child, soaring over the Nile. Now they circled the dead. He wondered what it would feel like to soar, to be free, to leave this place behind. He wondered if the birds ever saw the bodies they circled and remembered who they were before they fell. He decided they did not. Birds, he thought, were wiser than men. They did not carry the weight of memory. And then, after 6 days of marching, he saw it on the horizon. The mountain of stone. The pyramid rose from the earth like a staircase to the sky, taller than anything he had ever seen. So vast it seemed to touch the heavens themselves. Even from a distance, he could see the workers crawling over it like ants. He could see the dust rising from the quarry. He could hear the faint echo of hammers against stone. He knew then he was never going home. The mountain of stone was not just a monument. It was a prison, a grave for the living. But he did not know that the gods had other plans. He did not know that a young healer would one day carry his story across the ages. He did not know that his name would be spoken by a fire thousands of years later in a world that had forgotten the pharaohs. I did not know Kemet then. I was still in my village, learning the ways of the healer, carrying the shame of my own past. But I would meet him soon enough. And when I did, I would see the fire in his eyes, the same fire that carried him through the march. I would see a man who had lost everything, but refused to let the fire die. He walked into the camp, and the gates closed behind him. He was no longer a farmer's son. He was no longer a boy. He was a laborer, a conscript, a tool for the Pharaoh's glory. But somewhere inside him, the fire still burned, a flame that refused to die. The gates closed behind Kemet with a sound like a tomb sealing shut. He stood in the shadow of the mountain, and for a long moment he could not breathe. The pyramid loomed above him, close now, so close he could see the individual stones, the ropes, the men crawling like insects across its face. Senua placed a hand on his shoulder. "Breathe, boy, one step at a time." Kemet breathed, and he took his first step into the camp. The overseers cut the leather straps from his wrists, and for the first time in days, his hands were free. But the marks remained deep red grooves where the leather had bitten into his skin. He flexed his fingers, and they ached with the memory of the bindings. The camp stretched for miles, a sprawling city of tents, dust, and despair. Thousands of men stood weary and bent from long labor, their backs bearing the marks of the overseer's whip. The air was thick with dust and sweat. The smell of burning lime from the kilns stung the eyes and throat. The sound of hammers on stone echoed across the desert, a sound that never stopped, day or night. Kemet had never seen so many men in one place. He had never heard such a constant, grinding noise. It pressed against his ears like a living thing, and he felt his chest tighten. He thought of his village, the quiet fields, the gentle sound of the river, his mother's humming. That world already felt like a dream. He wondered if he would ever see it again. He wondered if he would even remember it. I have seen that look in many men, child. The look of a soul trying to hold on to itself. Some held on, others let go. Kemet held on. He was given a wooden hammer, and a copper chisel. He was told to cut stones from the quarry until his hands bled. Each man had a daily quota, a certain number of stones they had to deliver to the overseers. Those who failed were beaten, or worse, left to die in the sun. The overseers were harsh men, Egyptian soldiers who had no mercy for the conscripts. They patrolled the quarry day and night, their whips always ready. Kemet learned quickly to keep his head down and his mouth shut, but he soon learned that the workers were divided into crews. Each crew had a name, and they took pride in their work. Some crews competed with one another, racing to see who could cut the most stone. There was a strange pride among them, a refusal to be broken. Kemet's crew called themselves the Strong Arms of Khufu. It was a strange thing, child pride in the middle of such suffering. But it kept them alive. It gave them a reason to wake up each morning. His crew leader was a man named Amun. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that had been shaped by years of stone cutting. His face was weathered, but his eyes were kind. He looked at Kemet and said, "You are young. You are scared. That is normal. But you are one of us now. We do not let our own fall." Kemet did not know what to say. He had not expected kindness. He had expected cruelty, like the overseers. But Amun's words settled into his chest like warmth. On his first day, Kemet picked up his hammer and chisel. He struck the stone. The shock ran up his arm and his hand stung. He struck again and again. His fingers began to bleed, but he did not stop. He worked beside Senua, who moved slowly but steadily, a rhythm that came from years of practice. "Slow and steady, boy," Senua said. "The stone is patient. It will wait. Do not wear yourself out in the first hour." But Kemet was stubborn. He wanted to prove himself. He wanted to show the overseers that he was not weak. He swung his hammer until his arm felt like it might fall off. At the end of the day, his hands were raw and bleeding. He could barely close his fingers. Senua knelt beside him and helped him wrap cloth around his palms. "You will learn," Senua said. "The stone teaches patience, and patience is survival." Kemet watched the other men as they returned to their tents. Some were laughing. Some were singing. Some were too exhausted to speak. He saw men sharing bread and water. He saw men helping each other clean wounds. And he realized that even in this place, even in the shadow of the mountain, there was a kind of brotherhood, a refusal to let each other fall. That night, Kemet sat with his crew around a small fire. They shared coarse bread and onions. Someone passed around a jar of thick beer brewed from barley. One of the men, a mason named Hori, told stories of gods and kings and mischievous spirits who wandered the desert at night. The men laughed softly. For a little while, they were not laborers beneath the pyramid. They were simply men sitting together beneath the stars. Kemet felt something stir inside him. Not hope, not yet, but something close. A warmth that reminded him that he was still human. He thought of his mother. He thought of his father. He thought of the fields he would never plow again. The small field beside his father's land that he had once dreamed of owning. That dream felt like a lifetime ago, but he still remembered it. And then he looked up at the stars. He remembered his father's voice, teaching him to read the sky, to find the northern star, to navigate the desert if he ever got lost. The stars are always true, his father had said. They do not lie. He looked up at the same stars now. They had not changed. They were the same stars his father had pointed out to him. They were the same stars his mother had prayed to. He closed his eyes. His voice trembled as he whispered into the night, a prayer not to the Pharaoh, not to the overseers, but to the stars. He prayed that his mother and father were still alive. He prayed that they had not forgotten him. He prayed that one day he would see them again. For a moment, he imagined his mother looking up at those same stars, thinking of him. He did not know if the gods were listening. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. And that, child, that is something that cannot be taken away. I have told you about Kemet's journey, child. Now let me tell you about mine. When I was 16, the summons came for healers to travel to the workers' camp beneath the Pharaoh's great pyramid. Word had spread that the construction was taking a terrible toll. Men dying from exhaustion, infection, and the cruelty of the overseers. I volunteered. Perhaps I believed that if I could save others, I might finally find a way to forgive myself. Perhaps I wanted to prove that I was no longer the girl who hid in the shadows. Perhaps I simply wanted to face the darkness that had haunted me since my brother was taken. Whatever the reason, I went. I gathered my bandages, my herbs, my few belongings. I kissed my mother's forehead and held my father's hands one last time. And I walked toward the mountain of stone that would change my life forever. The journey took 7 days. I traveled with a small group of healers, women and men, who had answered the same call. We walked through the desert under the scorching sun, and at night we slept beneath the stars. I did not speak much. I was too afraid. I remember the first time I saw the pyramid. It rose from the earth like a mountain of stone, so vast it seemed to touch the sky. I had heard stories, but seeing it with my own eyes was different. It was terrifying. It was awe-inspiring. It was a monument to the Pharaoh's power and a grave for the living. I thought of my brother. I wondered if he had seen the same sight. I wondered if he had felt the same fear. I wondered if he was still alive. The camp appeared before us as the sun was setting. Thousands of tents stretched across the desert. The smell of burning lime stung my eyes. The sound of hammers echoed endlessly, a sound that never stopped, day or night. I walked through the gates, and for a moment I could not breathe. I had never seen so many men in one place. They were everywhere, some working, some resting, some lying motionless on the ground. Their backs were scarred from the overseer's whip. Their hands were raw and bleeding. Their eyes were empty. I wanted to run. I wanted to hide. I wanted to go home. But I remembered my brother. I remembered my shame. I remembered the sound of my mother's scream, and I stayed. The guards led me to a small tent and told me, "Fix them. Keep them working. If they die, we whip you." They left me with a bundle of cloth and a jar of ointment. That night, I sat alone in my tent and wept. I wept for my brother. I wept for my mother. I wept for the life I had left behind. I wept because I was afraid. I have walked through the desert myself, child. I know the weight of the sun. I know the cruelty of the mirage, but I never had to walk it in chains. Kemet did, and he survived. The next morning, I walked among the men. I saw their backs bearing the marks of long labor, crisscrossed with scars from the overseer's whip. Their hands were clawed from pulling stone, their nails broken and bleeding. And their eyes were empty, hollow, and broken. And I thought of my brother. I wondered if he had looked like them. I wondered if he had suffered like them. I never searched for him, child. I wanted to. I dreamed of finding him, of bringing him home. But I was a child. I had no money, no protection, no way to travel across Egypt. And my mother, she begged me not to leave. She said she could not lose me too. So I stayed, and I carried the guilt, and I learned to heal so that I could save the ones who were still alive. But standing in that camp, surrounded by the suffering, I realized something. I could not save my brother, but I could save others, and that was enough. I wanted to help them all, but I could not. I could only help one at a time. I knelt beside a man whose shoulder was bleeding. I cleaned the wound with water from the Nile, and I wrapped it in clean cloth. He looked at me, a young man, perhaps 18, and whispered, "Thank you." I nodded. I could not speak. I moved to the next man, and the next, hands ached and my back screamed for rest. But I did not stop. I could not stop. I had spent years feeling powerless. Now I had a purpose. But even as I worked, I felt the weight of the camp pressing down on me. I saw men collapse from exhaustion. I saw men die, their bodies carried away without ceremony. I saw the overseers whip men who could not meet their quotas. I told myself that I was helping. I told myself that my work mattered. But the truth was darker. I was a tool of the Pharaoh's ambition. I was keeping men alive so they could continue their labor. That thought haunted me. I wanted to heal. I wanted to ease suffering. But I could not save them from the camp. I could only patch their wounds and send them back to work. I told myself that I would not become hardened. I told myself that I would remember every face, that I would honor their suffering, that I would carry their stories with me. But the faces blurred together. The wounds became routine, and I began to forget. At night, I could no longer remember which wound belonged to which man. And then I met Kemet. I was walking through the camp when I saw a young man with a wound on his shoulder, a deep gash from a fallen stone, festering with dust. The wound was red and angry, and I could see the infection spreading. I saw him with his crew, the strong arms of Khufu, led by a kind man named Amen. I did not know it then, but that crew would become his family. I knelt beside him, and I began to clean the wound. He looked at me with tired eyes and asked, "Why do you help us?" I said, "Because you are men, not stones." He smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen since arriving at the camp. His eyes crinkled at the corners, and for a moment, I saw the boy he once was. He asked my name. I told him Senua. He said, "I will remember that name, Senua. When I am free, I will remember that a healer called me a man." I did not know then that he would keep his word. I did not know that his freedom would become my own. But I saw something in his eyes, a fire that refused to die. And I felt something stir in my chest, a warmth I had not felt in years. I thought, if he can endure this, surely I can be brave. That was the moment I stopped being a girl. I became a healer, someone who could hold the hands of the dying and not look away. And I decided, child, I decided I would never hide again. After that first day, I visited Kemet whenever I could, not because I had to. There were many wounded men, and I could have spent my time elsewhere. But I found myself drawn to him, to the fire I had seen in his eyes, to the quiet strength he carried despite everything he had lost. At first, I told myself I was simply checking his wound. The infection had been dangerous. I needed to make sure it was healing. But the truth was simpler. I wanted to hear his voice. I wanted to feel the warmth I felt when I sat beside him. I visited him every few days. I would change the bandage, check the wound, and then we would talk. At first, the conversations were small: the weather, the work, the quality of the bread. But slowly, they grew deeper. He told me about his village. He spoke of the Nile, the green fields, the goats he used to chase as a boy. He told me about his father, the farmer, with the strong hands and the quiet love. He told me about his mother, the weaver who hummed while she worked. She hummed old songs, he said. Songs about the gods, about the river, about the fields. I said my mother hummed too. He looked at me. Did she? I nodded. Before the soldiers came. After that, she stopped. He did not press me. He simply waited. And in the silence, I felt something shift inside me. I had never told anyone about my mother. I had never told anyone about the day my brother was taken. But that night, sitting beside Kemet beneath the stars, I felt safe enough to speak. I told him about my village, about the fisherman who smiled before he learned to grieve, about the weaver who stopped humming, about my brother taken when I was 10, leaving me with nothing but shame. I told him how I had hidden, how I had heard my mother scream and done nothing, how I had carried that shame for years. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "You were a child, Senua." I said, "I know." But the shame did not care that I was a child. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I understand." And I knew that he did. We sat together in the darkness, two strangers bound by the same sorrow. The stars burned above us, cold and distant, and yet they felt closer than they had in years. A cool desert wind moved through the camp, carrying the smell of dust and distant cooking fires. He pointed up at the sky. "My father taught me to read the stars," he said. "He taught me to find the northern star. He said it would always guide me home." I looked up and did it. He was silent for a moment. "I have not seen home in many months, but the stars have not changed. They are the same stars my father pointed out to me. They are the same stars my mother prayed to." I thought about my own father, the fisherman who had taught me to read the river. He had never taught me the stars. He had taught me to watch the water, to sense the change in the air, to know when the storms were coming. "My father taught me the river," I said. Kemet turned to me. "The river is a kind of star," he said. "It always knows where to go." I thought about that. I thought about the Nile, flowing toward the sea, patient and eternal. I thought about my father standing in his boat, casting his nets into the mist. I thought about the life I had left behind. I have spent years trying to forget, I said. I thought that if I could forget, I could be free. He said, and did it work? I shook my head. It only made the shame heavier. He said, I believe that we must remember, that we must carry the past with us, not as a burden, but as a guide. I looked at him. That is what Senu taught you, is it not? He nodded. I survive because I remember who I am. It was then that I understood. Forgetting had never freed me. It had only deepened the wound. Healing would begin not with forgetting, but with remembering, carrying the past with me, not as a weight, but as a guide. That night I wept again, but this time the tears were different. This time they were not tears of shame. They were tears of release. I decided, child. I decided I would no longer hide from my past. I would carry it with me. I would honor my brother's memory. I would honor my own pain. And I would heal. And that, child, that is the power of being seen by someone who understands. Weeks passed. The work did not stop. The hammers never fell silent. But something had changed inside me. I no longer felt like a stranger among the men. I had begun to know their faces. I had begun to learn their names. And I had begun to care. I visited Kemet whenever I could. Our conversations had become a kind of anchor, a reminder that there was still goodness in the world, still hope, still fire. But it was not Kemet who would change everything. It was an old man named Senu. I had seen Senu many times. He was always beside Kemet, a bent, weathered figure with hands like claws, twisted from years of gripping stone. He moved slowly, but his eyes were sharp, and his mind was quick. One night, I was walking through the camp when I saw them sitting together. Senu was speaking in a low voice, and Kemet was listening, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the old man's face. I should have walked away. I should have given them their privacy, but something held me in place. I stepped closer, staying in the shadows. My heart was pounding. I knew I should not be listening, but I could not move. Senu said, "The merchants speak of distant lands beyond the desert, places where the Pharaoh's hand grows weak. They say there are villages where no overseer's whip has ever been seen." Kemet's voice was barely a whisper. "How do we find them?" Senu said, "We must watch. We must wait. We must be ready when the gods give us a sign." I felt my breath catch in my throat. I knew what they were planning. They were planning to escape, and foot slipped. A small stone rolled across the ground. The conversation stopped. Senu stood slowly. His eyes scanned the darkness. Kemet's face changed, his body tensed, his hands clenched. Neither spoke. Several seconds passed, long, terrible seconds. I stepped out of the shadows. They saw me. Kemet's eyes widened. Senu's hand moved to his side, as if reaching for a weapon he did not have. For a long moment, no one spoke. I could see the fear in Kemet's eyes. I could see the suspicion in Senu's. Then I said, "I will not tell anyone." They stared at me. Kemet looked at me, a long, searching look. Fear and hope warred in his eyes. "Why would you protect us?" he asked quietly. "If the guards find out, you will be punished too." I held his gaze. 6 years ago, I hid while my brother was taken from our village. I heard him call my name, and I did nothing. I have carried that shame every day since. I paused. I could feel the weight of the words leaving my mouth. Heavy, painful, true. I will not hide again. Kemet stared at me for a long moment. I could see him weighing my words. I could see him deciding whether to trust me. Finally, he said quietly, "Then you understand what is at stake." I nodded. "I do." I walked away. I did not look back. That night, I lay in my tent, staring at the darkness. I had made a choice, a dangerous choice. I had become complicit in their plan. If the guards found out, they would whip me or worse. But I did not feel afraid. For the first time in years, I felt something else. I felt proud. I felt that I had finally done what I should have done years ago. I had not hidden. I had not looked away. I had chosen courage over fear. And that, child, that is the first step toward freedom. But the escape plan was only beginning. Kemet had found his hope. Senua had made her choice. And the most dangerous part of their journey was yet to come. That night, I lay in my tent, staring at the darkness. I had made a choice, a dangerous choice. I had become complicit in their plan. If the guards found out, they would whip me or worse. But I did not feel afraid. For the first time in years, I felt something else. I felt proud. I felt that I had finally done what I should have done years ago. I had not hidden. I had not looked away. I had chosen courage over fear. And that, child, that is the first step toward freedom. But the escape plan was only beginning. Kemet had found his hope. Senua had made her choice. And the most dangerous part of their journey was yet to come. This is where we pause for now, child. The fire still burns. The stars still watch. And I will carry you back again soon. If you wish to continue, part 2 is waiting for you. The night is still young, and the story is not yet over. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe. Your support means the world to me. It tells me that you want to hear more stories like this, stories of forgotten voices, of courage in the darkness, of freedom found against all odds. I am just one storyteller, child, but with your help, I can keep these stories alive. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. I will see you again soon. Rest now and dream of freedom